Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business is a debate on motion 22770 in the name of Shirley-Ann Somerville on advancing equality and human rights for minority ethnic people and communities. Can I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Shirley-Ann Somerville to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't believe it would be an overstatement to say that these are indeed unique times we are all living in, and that in the past few months we have faced some unique challenges as a society. The COVID-19 pandemic has also exposed, exacerbated and amplified some of the long-standing issues that we face, both here in Scotland and indeed worldwide. And one of the foremost among these is the journey we still face to achieve real, meaningful equality for minority ethnic people and communities. Presiding Officer, I'm sure everyone in this chamber is aware that as we have moved through the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen the tragic evidence of the stark health inequalities faced by some minority ethnic groups. And I will again extend my heartfelt sympathies to everyone who has lost a loved one as a result of the pandemic. But COVID-19 has also shone a harsh light on the long-standing, deep-rooted racial inequality that exists not only in health but across all areas of life, from education to housing to employment. Racism and inequality are not new, and they're not going to resolve themselves even as we move out of the crisis into recovery. We must take action. As the First Minister said in her introduction to this year's programme for government, we have an opportunity as we move forward from the COVID-19 crisis to not simply return to how things were before, but to address the challenges we face as a society and to build Scotland back fairer and stronger. And that is an opportunity we must absolutely take. We must address the inequality experienced by minority ethnic people. We must address the systemic problems that allow that inequality continue. And we must make the changes we need to make in order to make the society fairer. Presiding Officer, there are particular commitments within the programme for government and our wider work across government that I would like to come to. But first, I want to make clear that there is no single action we can take that will achieve equality. There is no one person or one group of people that carries the responsibility for this work. Every single one of us, across every part of society, can and must think about what we can do to advance and promote equality for and with minority ethnic communities. I know that others in this chamber have spoken about the need to be more than just not racist, but actively anti-racist. That is a responsibility we can all take on. Whoever we are, we can choose to educate ourselves on inequality. We can choose to speak up when we see something that isn't fair. We can choose to talk to our children about right and wrong so that future generations are clear about the responsibility that they have too. But there is, of course, a responsibility on us in government to drive that work forward and to set the pace for progress. That is why we're working towards ensuring that equality and human rights are embedded throughout our work across portfolios. It is why, as the First Minister announced earlier this year, we will be scaling up our commitment with a new Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights Directorate. That will help to ensure that we can continue to put equality and human rights at the forefront of everything we do and as central to all our future ambitions to create a stronger, fairer Scotland. Supporting our young people to fulfil their potential is a key part of achieving that long-lasting equality. There are voices, they are the voices we must amplify today so that they can be heard clearly and loudly tomorrow. To help achieve that, we announced in our programme for government that we would be funding the Leadership Development Programme for minority ethnic young people. The programme, delivered by the John Smith Centre, will offer living wage placements for up to 50 people across the public and third sectors. I very much hope that some colleagues here today will be able to take up the opportunity to have a young person placed with them. I have no doubts that the benefits of the programme will be felt by both parties in this arrangement. Crucially, this programme isn't just about short-term work experience. It's about helping us break down the barriers that young people face when entering public service and supporting them to develop the skills they need for lifelong professional and personal success. And it is about improving representation in public service, helping us deliver on our commitments to genuinely reflect the rich and diverse society we are fortunate to live in. Of course, focused action like this is only one piece of that jigsaw. We must also look at the bigger picture, which is why we're exploring how to take forward the recommendations of the Expert Reference Group on COVID-19 and ethnicity across all portfolios. This includes a commitment to look closely at undertaking an audit of our past and current initiatives to tackle systemic racism, so we can understand not only what we have done well, but also, very importantly, how we need to improve as we go forward. In a health context, the Expert Reference Group made a number of recommendations in relation to data. We intend to act on those to improve our evidence base on health outcomes for minority ethnic people and allow us to take appropriate action to respond to these disparities. There is, of course, far more to be said about the work of the Expert Reference Group, and their recommendations are indeed wide-ranging. They offer real and very challenging circumstances to the Scottish Government, and rightly so. We will publish a response to this in the coming weeks, which will reflect the actions that we are taking across many portfolios and the responsibility we have across government. And the debate today will help us formulate our response to that report. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the co-chairs and the members of the group for the remarkable work they've done to date. The members have given such a significant amount of their time to the group since it was established in June, and their contributions have not only been in-depth and complex, but have delivered an incredibly challenging timescales as well. The expert advice that the group's members have brought to the Scottish Government's COVID response has been and continues to be very valuable. That the group also provided evidence on the systemic issues beyond the immediate aspects of COVID is also invaluable. This is a good point to say I'm happy to support the amendments that are both in the names of Polly McNeill and Jeremy Balfour today as well, Presiding Officer. Jeremy Balfour's amendment could be construed as suggesting that we shouldn't commit to responding to the Expert Reference Group's recommendations until after the Public Sector Equality Duty Review concludes. Given the impact of COVID-19 on minority ethnic people and communities, we would not want our response to the Expert Reference Group delayed due to that separate work, and I'm sure Mr Balfour would not want that either. But I can reassure him that there has already been extensive engagement ahead of our review of the Scottish specific sector equality duties and will continue to do so. I will say again that inequality is felt across every part of society, and I have no doubt that the breadth of the recommendations that the Expert Advisory Group will look at will be a guiding light on our forward path. As well, the work outlined in the Expert Reference Group, we have, of course, continued to take forward the activity that has been ongoing since before COVID struck. It is clear that education, for example, has a vital role to play in building a society which actively challenges racism, eliminates racial discrimination and advances equality. Our Curriculum for Excellence provides opportunities to teach Black history and race equality. However, we are clear that this is not always the experience of our pupils, and we will work with our stakeholders and partners about what further opportunities there are to make sure all children and young people understand Scotland's history and how that history impacts on our society today. While minority ethnic representation in teaching has increased since 2015, we are also working to ensure numbers continue to improve. We are exploring alternative pathways into teaching for minority ethnic and other underrepresented groups, and we will do this in part through the Increasing Diversity in the Teaching Profession Working Group. But beyond the formal education in our schools, we are all continually learning at every age and every stage. Our museums and cultural offerings also play a huge part in that, and that is why in our programme for government we confirmed that we will sponsor an independent expert group to advise on how Scotland's existing and future museum collections can better recognise and represent a more accurate portrayal of Scotland's colonial and slavery history. Presiding Officer, that understanding of our history is, of course, vitally important. But even today, we are all very clear that racism is something no country, Scotland included, can claim to be immune from. We remain committed to taking this opportunity to shape hate crime legislation so that it is fit for the 21st century Scotland and, most importantly, affords sufficient protection for those that need it. The bill will make it clear to victims, perpetrators and communities that offences motivated by prejudice, including racism, will be treated seriously and will not be tolerated. Sending that strong message is, of course, a vital part of ensuring that minority ethnic communities are able to live in a fair and equal society. And our National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership is considering, as part of its recommendations, incorporation of the United Nations Convention on Racial Discrimination. Presiding Officer, my colleague, the Minister for Older People and Equality, spoke in this chamber in June about our Race Equality Action Plan and the progress we are making and still need to make to achieve its goals. She spoke about the £2.6 million that we've allocated in funding over the last financial year and noted that we will, in 2021, be publishing our final report on the current Race Equality Action Plan. That report, along with the actions I have touched on today, and the work progressing across the Scottish Government and its partners, will help to shape our focus and our direction as we move forward. Presiding Officer, I would like to end by saying that, again, this is not something that Government can do alone. We must all, in every sector of society, shoulder our share of the responsibility to tackle racism and injustice and to move towards the fairer society we all deserve and want to see. I'm committed to doing my part. This Government is committed to doing its part, and I hope that this Parliament can come together and join with that commitment. I move the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Jeremy Balfour to speak to and move Amendment 2277.2.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to open the debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservative Group. I thank the Scottish Government for bringing the debate to the Chamber and allowing us as a Parliament to discuss this important issue. Last week I spoke in a members' debate brought forward by Stuart McMillan when we debated how we can recognise and represent a more accurate portrayal of Scotland's colonial and slavery history, which was mentioned as an action in this year's programme of government. All the speakers agreed that if we want to build a more equitable future here in Scotland, we must not forget Scots' participation in slavery, nor should we assume that simply because we live in a modern era, everything is much better. Recent events have shown us that this is clearly not the case. I hope that we all share the deep concern that so many feel about continued racial injustice across the world and in this country, that we stand in solidarity with those calling for change. We must also recognise that we all have a responsibility to identify and remove the barriers of structural racism that still exist in our society, and we must make this a priority. No one should be marginalised or discriminated against because of their race or background, yet sadly there is evidence that many black and ethnic minority people in Scotland continue to experience discrimination despite political action to address this issue. The last census, carried out in 2011, stated that the size of the black and minority ethnic population in Scotland has doubled over that 10-year period, accounting for just over 200,000 people, or 4% of the total population of Scotland. Despite the increase in the population, critical issues of concern continue to be revealed, as it is our shame that many minority ethnic communities continue to experience racism and inequality to a greater extent than the rest of society. In the 2019 Scottish Household Survey, 19% of ethnic minorities reported experiencing discrimination. In 2019, the employment rate for the minority ethnic community aged 16 to 64 was 59.3%, lower than the white population, which has an employment rate of 75.7%. The minority ethnic employment gap is much higher for women than men, and people from minority ethnic groups are more likely to be in poverty. The COVID-19 pandemic has delivered a profound shock that has affected everyone, and evidence suggests that the UK's minority ethnic groups are being disproportionately affected by this virus. A number of reviews, including by the Office for National Statistics and Public Health England, have confirmed that this is the case, suggesting reasons include existing health inequalities, housing conditions, public-facing occupants, and structural racism. Minority ethnic people are disproportionately employed in the NHS and other key worker industries, and in such cases have a higher likelihood of living in multi-generational families, both of which may increase the risk of transmission and infection. We also have a higher rate of certain underlying health conditions, such as diabetes and heart disease, which can increase the risk of severe health effects if you get the virus. In Scotland, data has been slow to emerge on the risk for minority ethnic groups, but analysis is starting to come forward. I welcome the decision taken by the Scottish Government to establish the expert reference group on ethnicity and COVID-19. Since the ERG was first established, more recent analysis by Public Health Scotland, National Records of Scotland, has confirmed increased risks associated with this virus in South Asians. But we need robust analysis, which is still not available for minority ethnic groups. I welcome a membership of a group consisting of academics and expert advisors. We have to learn from lived experience. It is so important that we listen to those who have that experience and to their suggestions for what we do next. What is practical, what can change, what can make things better. I very much hope the creation of the ERG and other 4 actions being taken forward by this government in response to the virus will help those with difficulties and understand why they are being affected more than other groups. The Coalition of Racial Equality Rights is quite clear that Scotland's public bodies and government have both ethical and legal imperatives to ensure the approach to managing how we come through these difficult times. It is therefore vital that all bodies with a role in gathering and sending out data are able to monitor what is going. There is no time to waste. We've seen this afternoon from the First Minister's statement that cases are increasing, and this is likely to continue, sadly, for the next few months. The Coalition of Racial Equality and Rights is concerned that proposals outlined in the Scottish Government programme for government are not enough to tackle racism, and one that good intentions are not enough. There needs to be a sense of urgency. They suggest a number of practical steps, including commencing immediate engagement with stakeholders, and that is why we have put down our amendment, and I welcome the government's acceptance of it. We need to hear from those who live with this day in, day out. This chamber, again, does not reflect that minority. Like disability, race is, over the years, been left behind by those of us within the political class. We need to hear from the grassroots as well as academics. We stand with the ethnic minority population in Scotland. We recognise that more needs to be done. We uphold their rights, the fight for equality, and I'm happy to move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Pauline McNeill to speak to and move Amendment 22770.3.
Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my name. We risk this being yet another debate discussing equality rights for the BMA community whilst not enough changes. So we must help to lay the foundations now in the final stages of this Parliament to ensure that we are at least on track to tackle the underrepresentation of BMA communities everywhere, to get in place the systems of data that will pinpoint where the biggest failings are so that we know where we must act immediately. But we also need to give some urgent priority to the work that needs to be done to improve the lives of BME women and employment, in education and protecting them in law. In particular, I think the radical approach of tackling the poor underrepresentation of black minority ethnic people in this place and in our society. There are many action points that Labour could have chosen in our amendment, but we chose the one that we have, and I'm glad that the Government have accepted it. The Coalition for Racial Equality have called for the Scottish Government to undertake the Equality Impact Assessment on the programme for government after believing that the Government had not done so for a number of years, and also suggested that an independent expert advisory group was appointed to work alongside the Government's race equality. We could have chosen that one, but we chose to focus on the work of the independent expert reference group on COVID-19 mentioned by Jeremy Balfour and by Cabinet Secretary, because we are in the midst of a pandemic. So we are calling on the Government to respond in full to the Group's recommendations as soon as possible. 1 year ago, in September 2019, Clare wrote an open letter to MSPs criticising the lack of focus on race in the Scottish Parliament over the last 20 years. So it's incumbent on us to make sure that we make the appropriate progress. Because the impact of COVID-19, as well as Black Lives Matter movement, has served to highlight the pre-existing inequalities. And in a recent Scottish Labour and Race Equality Group meeting, one local organisation expressed alarm during their consultation when it was suggested that Black Lives Matter is a phenomenon that would pass. It will not pass, and none of us in here believe that. It has awoken a younger generation who are now campaigning for action and for change, which we must back. This pandemic has had a devastating impact on many people in the BMA community. Data in England and Wales suggests that BMA people are disproportionately dying with the coronavirus. However, due to a lack of similar data, we can't conclusively say that that is the situation in Scotland. And that's because there has been a lack of disaggregated data covering the BMA community in Scotland for some time. But COVID has really brought that into sharp relief, what a problem that it is. More needs to be done to work out why COVID-19 is affecting the BME community. But one thing that we do know is that socio-economic factors at play in the lives of many black minority ethnic people make them more at risk of dying from coronavirus. It's truly shameful that we don't yet know why. It was the expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity that stressed in their report that a lack of this adequate data to monitor the needs of different ethnic groups, particularly in relation to the health consequences of the pandemic and the lack of ongoing monitoring of ethnic inequalities in health in Scotland, has been long-standing. It was Professor Sean Trewick from the University of Aberdeen who said, "Within COVID studies, it is often the case that not only is there no special attempt to make it easier for Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups to take part, but there is no record of the ethnicity of any participants. So we clearly need to have a higher proportion of individuals across the spectrum of those communities, but often we don't." But we do know that international studies have suggested that there is an increased risk that BME people will have an acute reaction to COVID or indeed die from the disease. And therefore, we need to put those steps in place, and we need to put them in place now. Risk assessments should be considered for Black, Asian and minority ethnic workers in roles where they are exposed to a large section of the general public or those infected with the virus as a standard working practice. Presiding officer, we will be supporting the other amendments this evening in the name of Jeremy Balfour and also in the name of John Finney from the Greens. The experience of asylum seekers during COVID has been particularly tough, and in Glasgow, the city that I represent, asylum seekers were moved out of their accommodation into hotels and their allowance was taken away. The charity Positive Action in Housing has described asylum seekers in Glasgow as being left malnourished with food not fit for human consumption. We must address the tragedy of the deaths in Glasgow, more recently Mercy Begum, who lost her life, and the awful events in Glasgow city centre suggest that asylum seekers housed in hotels, possibly to the end of the year, requires an urgent way to address how people living with trauma already are living their lives. And therefore, I think it's appropriate for a fatal accident inquiry into those deaths. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour stands against prejudice and injustice in all its forms. Here in Scotland, we have an obligation to recognise and actively oppose racism. Black Lives Matter has shone a light on the systemic racism that has existed for centuries in the UK and in Scotland, which still impacts on the life chances and life experiences and life outcomes of BME groups. We must not be content to see the issue of racism as something that others perpetrate. We also need to recognise that all of us have a subconscious bias and be alert to the possibility that at times we might be inadvertently part of the problem. Presiding Officer, I move.
Thank you very much. I now call on John Finney.
On both amendments at decision time. That motion talks about the independent expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity and believes rightly that the recommendations will be invaluable. That being the case, I would hope the Scottish Government would play a very clear rationale for not progressing any of the recommendations where that be the case. Of course, it's not the only ongoing review that's ongoing. The Scottish Parliament's Equality and Human Rights have an ongoing consultation to identify what the Scottish Government and other public bodies, including regulatory and oversight bodies, need to do to ensure that the measures taken in relation to the pandemic minimises the negative effects on equality and human rights. And I would, like one of the cross-party groups, indeed the cross-party group on multiple sclerosis that I'm involved with, would encourage participation with that. The motion talks about promoting equality and human rights for minority ethnic communities and says that should be a priority, and certainly with a global pandemic, one would have thought this would be an opportunity for a worldwide focus on that priority, the laudable goal of promoting equality and human rights for all. No surprise to anyone that this pandemic has delivered a disproportionate negative impact on many already embattled minority communities. Sadly, instead, we saw the 75th session of the UN General Assembly opened last Tuesday with scheduled speeches from President Bolsonaro, Trump, Erdogan and Jinping of China. As Human Rights Watch said, hardly a stellar group of human rights defenders, adding it will be up to other governments to provide the counterweight. Only last week, in her first State of the Union address, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, denounced Poland's, quote here, LGBT-free zones, humanity-free zones, based in the Union. Very welcome that the Commission will soon put forward a strategy to strengthen LGBT rights in Europe. President Officer, be under no illusions that forces around the world driven by the same ideology that attacks minorities, attacks welfares, demonises non-compliance with their narrow, pernicious outlook on humanity and society are hard at work and have developed gentle ways to pay their bile. Not the blunt, we hate immigrants, rather the shameful, isn't it a shame that poppies won't be sold in some areas as to not offend immigrants? Support we challenge. Vigilance is required, consistency is required, and that falls for all of us. It's disappointing that the UK government's disregard of the rule of law, even when there are implications for an international peace treaty, set a very bad example. It's consistent with their submissive approach to judicial rulings which go against its hostile environment outlook. And of course, this is a UK government continues its callous attack on our welfare state, and we know who suffers from that. So it's everyone's responsibility, and we will look for leadership, and the Scottish Government has acted more progressively and compassionately than all these other governments, and the incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is a very positive step, but I'm sure, as I think we heard from the Minister, there's no complacency, and nor should there be. There's a long way to go. Gypsy Traveller community, for instance, there's welcome progress there, not least on the question of engagement. But we still have a long way to go to address the ever-pervasive toxic masculinity that impacts on the domestic abuse figures. Bill was a welcome step forward, but there's still the disgrace of sexual crime victims awaiting access to this. And of course, it doesn't just fall on parliamentarians. I'm delighted that the trade union movement continued to be at the forefront of diversity training. I noticed last week that the Fire Brigade Union were advertising some. Importantly, there's no hierarchy of special groups. I think that in the coming to a close, Presiding Officer, I think we need to recognise that we continue to talk. That's important. We need to have specific action, as the Scottish Government motion says. But arguably more important, we need to improve lives, alter the narrative, and lead to a more inclusive, just and welcoming Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. This motion will obviously command the support of these benches tonight, and with it all of the amendments. In particular, I welcome the section that says it's all of our responsibilities to tackle racism in Scottish society, whether that is in the institutions in which we work or calling it out online or in person. We won't see anything close to an end to racial discrimination without everyone here playing their part. So we absolutely need to tie every one of the excellent contributions made in the Chamber this afternoon to action, and something with some more concrete action points which we've seen from people like the Commission for Racial Equality, which I will come on to later, because we cannot carve out a route to breaking down prejudice and racism without that. We've now had the initial recommendations published by the Expert Reference Group on COVID-19 and ethnicity. It does seem that we have some initial problems with conclusive data, but the group has given some helpful submissions and suggestions in how to improve this, and I look forward to the government's response to them. Any one of us can legitimately feel frightened or vulnerable at this time of national crisis in the teeth of this virus, but knowing that you are more at risk because of you are either black or from an ethnic minority background is absolutely terrifying. And you are greeted by that reality in the shocking news you see every week and every day as this virus crisis unfolds. And as we work to understand this virus, the more we can learn, the faster, the better. And just last week, we took evidence at the Equalities and Human Rights Committee on the efforts to improve diversity in public bodies. HM Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Jill Imrie's report, was very sobering reading in terms of its review of Police Scotland's lack of diversity, as it described, and leadership training. She found that there was a general lack of leadership training and diversity skills within senior officers that required particularly urgent attention. And during Thursday's session, I asked about the wellbeing survey that is conducted right across the force and undertaken across all staff at all levels. The last one of these, presiding officer, was undertaken in 2015. That is so long ago. And how are we to understand how officers and staff from black or minority ethnic backgrounds feel if the last time we asked them how they feel was some 5 years ago? And whilst one was due out this year, it was delayed because of the virus. 5 years is definitely far too long to wait between them. So I was glad to hear that they intend to move to more regular ones, and we'll wait to see the outputs of those surveys. Because how can we possibly begin to understand unless we capture that lived experience? Currently, around 1% of police officers are from a minority background, so there's a long way to go before our police force looks like the country it seeks to serve. But we would all seek to make that happen, because I think it will make it a more responsive force for that. And I welcome the proactive recruitment initiatives we were told about in committee, and we'll monitor to see, I hope, these translate into better recruitment statistics, hopefully internal promotion as well, to see minority background police officers in leadership roles. I'm really pleased to see that October's Black History Month grow each year, particularly in our schools. Making sure young people have a good understanding of Black history is important, but so too is society-wide education. There's certainly a huge gap in knowledge about Scotland's role in the slave trade, and that's why I'm absolutely supportive of a Museum of Empire, the creation of a Museum of Empire, to look at the checkered history of Britain's and Scotland's past in the slave trade. And I do hope that the work already undertaken by the Coalition for Racial Equality and the Rights, which has so far produced an online museum, will result in an actual museum that is a permanent reminder for visitors to attend for years to come. This museum could be the centre of a more accurate portrayal of Scotland's history of colonial and slavery history. We need to recognise that there are all too many figures memorialised and revered.
And please conclude.
Oh, right. Yes, of course.
Yes.
So it is my great pleasure, presiding officer, to support the government's motion today.
I could listen to you forever, but you don't have forever, Mr Cole-Hamilton. Open debate speeches from, firstly, Ruth Maguire, followed by Alexander Stewart. Ms Maguire, please.
Presiding officer, I share the Scottish Government belief that promoting equality and human rights for minority ethnic communities should be a priority, and reaffirm my belief that there is a responsibility on everyone in society to tackle racism, prejudice and discrimination. Now, while I stand here doing that, I'm acutely aware that our Parliament is not yet representative of all the communities we serve, and in acknowledging that, state again that it's incumbent on all political parties to take action to address that. The Cabinet Secretary outlined in opening that equality for minority ethnic people and communities is a key part of the Scottish Government's ongoing commitment to a fairer Scotland. The mainstreaming approach that the government's taking by weaving race equality throughout the programme for government is the right one and has been welcomed by the STUC Black Workers Committee for its broad focus on supporting BME workers and communities across different policy areas, including employment, education, health and housing. They also commented positively on the announcements covering BME young people, older people and parents. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee this afternoon. However, I will briefly mention our inquiry into race equality, employment and skills. The committee is currently taking evidence and will report in October. The themes emerging from our inquiry are not unfamiliar. There have been few surprises, and the key test for our committee will be how to make meaningful progress forward, rather than just once again flagging issues. This is something we are very focused on. And I think the work of the expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity provides an opportunity to do just that, to move forward. And whilst those recommendations are specifically around COVID-19, they address other known issues and themes which would assist greatly in making progress towards equality more generally, namely data, accountability and participation. Recommendation 9, which is in there as an urgent recommendation, is around participation by minority ethnic people and communities. And it says that people and communities must be at the heart of any initiative to improve ethnicity recording and closely involved in driving forward such initiatives. Minority ethnic communities racialised by the data process need to be involved to make sure it's worthwhile and not just another tick box exercise. And they say this will help ensure the work meets the needs of Scotland's diverse communities and also facilitate success. I thought it was interesting that they state that not being willing to provide ethnicity information is rare when the reason for its collection is appropriately explained. That principle of participation is crucial, and I would echo Sikh Sanjog's request that there must be a wide representation of lived experiences when considering and informing the Scottish Government approach to COVID-19 on BME communities. The expert user group also recommend consideration should be given to reporting related characteristics in addition whenever possible. Ethno-religious communities such as our Jewish and Sikh communities should be better identified and responded to by enabling a religious indicator and data collation. This seems like a really important point, and I would welcome the Minister's thoughts on that when she closes. Presiding Officer, I think we all agree that action is required, so let's make sure that we take that action. As Clare have said recently, we can't find ourselves in 10 years' time having the same discussions and making the same recommendations. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. I'd have to remind members that it's 4-minute speeches, remember. Alexander Stewart, followed by Bill Kidd. Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am pleased to have the opportunity this afternoon to participate in this debate on the incredibly important issue of promoting equality and human rights for minority ethnic people and communities across Scotland. We all share that desire to uphold the rights of people from ethnic minority backgrounds and fight for equalities, to tackle discrimination and racism wherever it takes place. While significant progress has been made in recent years to address discrimination and the marginalisation of those from BME backgrounds, there is still much work to be done in the area. In order to tackle these issues, we need to make sure that we properly understand the challenges that face individuals. Only last year, nearly 1 in 5 ethnic minority individuals said that they had experienced discrimination. This has to change, and this has to be challenged at every opportunity. It has to stop, Deputy Presiding Officer. In addition to those from backgrounds, significant employment issues have risen. When we see at a rate of 16.4% lower in the ethnic minority population than in the white population. And we've already heard today that the gap in women and for individuals is much wider and much higher for these women than it is for men. The UK Government and the Scottish Government are tackling the issue, and the Prime Minister has established a Commission for Race and Ethnic Disparities. The group has 10 commissioners, and they are there and they're giving experience of a variety of sectors to consider the inequalities in many different policy areas, including health, education, the criminal justice and employment. Also, the Scottish Government have issued and see further progress in this area, and that is extremely welcome, that they are working together across the Parliament to see what can be achieved. I am particularly pleased to see that there has been a comprehensive approach about data collection. The analysis of that data is so important, and we must try and achieve that. The progress that has been received from the Race Equality Action Plan once again shows us a real step forward, and the minority and majority of individuals under this pandemic has shown a light, and that has shone a light that has given some real issues, Deputy Presiding Officer. It has been considered, and the facts that minority ethnic individuals can contract the coronavirus has shown that individuals from various backgrounds and communities are much more susceptible. This is something that has been recognised by the Scottish Government, the UK Government and organisations around the world. These disparities seem to have resulted in a fixed risk factor. It has also been formed that economic factors have a role to play, because disproportionately individuals who are key workers or work in key roles or public-facing jobs may find themselves exposed in that factor. We've also heard that from the Bangladesh community origins, individuals are much more susceptible. Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, Asian are between 10 and 50% more likely to die from the coronavirus disease because of their ethnicity, and that has to be recognised. Getting the most important information on record to health and equalities and making sure that we can tackle these is vitally important, Deputy Presiding Officer. In conclusion, I, like many others across this chamber, wish to see, and we will, as the Scottish Conservatives, do all we can to promote, to protect, to enhance the rights of those from minority ethnic backgrounds, because that's vitally important. By working together, we can further ensure progress in ruling out discrimination and marginalisation to ensure that everybody in Scotland has equal opportunities, no matter what their background. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. And I call Bill Kidd. We follow by Anna Sarwar. Mr Kidd, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I'd like to start by emphasising my sincere thanks to the members of the Expert Reference Group on COVID-19 and Ethnicity. We are able to participate in an informed and targeted parliamentary debate today because it is centred on a report of high quality created by people with care for its outcome. That this should not be a box-ticking exercise, but a means by which effective change can be made. The ERG has engaged with various complex factors surrounding COVID-19's distinct impact on ethnic minority people and communities, and has done so in an honest and professional way. This is not a simple or easy task, so I want to highlight my thanks to them for their time and thoughtful consideration put into this over recent months. Following on from the publication of the Group's recommendations relating to systemic issues and risks for minority ethnic people as a background to COVID-19, the Group's comprehensive recommendations show a number of routes that could be pursued by the Scottish Government and public bodies. These recommendations would allow for serious engagement with the larger issues at hand. I would like to echo the ERG's emphasis on the importance of ensuring that the action taken in response to this is done so in ways that are deliberately measurable and accountable. As the recommendations point out, it is no good to continuously highlight similar or the same issues without real change being achieved, and we need to build on existing research rather than duplicate it. Recommendation 9 of the paper relates to the Scottish Government's Race Equality Action Plan, which I believe is due to be renewed in 2021. The point raised that this is an opportunity for ensuring clear actions, outputs of measurable action is extremely positive, and I think a very sensible suggestion from the ERC. The focus on accountability within the Scottish Government's departments on the micro and macro levels is also important in pushing forward real movement in the underpinning issues of racial inequalities and COVID-19. We have an opportunity to lead by example. The sooner we discern concrete and deliverable next steps, the better. I want to also urge the Scottish Government to consider recommendation 2. This relates to what support can be offered to people without recourse to public funds. particularly to discern what steps can be taken to help asylum seekers and victims of human trafficking who may be living in plain sight in Scotland, working in modern slavery without awareness of what rights or health support they may have. The pandemic heightens vulnerabilities, and these groups are no exception. The backdrop of racial inequalities to the distinct health issues faced by minority ethnic people and communities during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is incredibly important. Though this may be stating the obvious, I think I ought to highlight that we will only be able to tackle systemic racism and racial inequalities through both a systemic and systematic approach to change. The ERG recommendations clearly lay out the complex and distinct issues facing minority ethnic people and the link to racial disparities which are underpinned by racism. Within this wider recognition of the persistence of racism which has risen during lockdown with the Black Lives Matter movement, I am hopeful that policy measures will be met on the ground with energised action and real motivation to tackle the issues head-on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. And I call Anna Sarwar to be followed by Joan McAlpine. Mr Sarwar, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I was asked a question yesterday. Aren't you bored and tired of debates about racism? And I'm kind of bored and tired of the debates. I want politicians. Politicians are brilliant at saying the right things, but are we brave enough to do the right things when it comes to challenging prejudice and hatred? There have been two significant moments in the last 6 months, or two significant issues in the last 6 months. One is, of course, COVID, and the second one is Black Lives Matter. Both, I think, connected, and I'll come to that in a moment. And I hear a lot of people saying that Black Lives Matter is a defining moment and will never go back to the way it was before, and things will fundamentally change. But we've said that many times before. We said it after the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the inquiry that followed. So it's on us, this generation of politicians, this generation of political leadership, about whether we do truly make it a defining moment or not. And we did go out and applaud key workers during the peak of the pandemic. And there are some specific reasons why BME communities are more likely to be the victims of COVID-19. It's because they're also disproportionately likely to be the ones that keep this country going. You're disproportionately more likely to work in the National Health Service if you're from a BME background. Disproportionately more likely to work in food production if you're from a BME background. Disproportionately more likely to work in transportation if you're from a BME background. Disproportionately more likely to work in a retail setting if you're from a BME background. Disproportionately more likely to work in a corner shop or a supermarket or indeed any other frontline service if you're from a BME community. If we are going to applaud and champion BME communities for helping keeping our country going through a pandemic, then we've also got to stand by them when we want to make them a central part of the future of our country. So are we brave enough to do the right things, not just say the right things at the right time when a movement is trending or a hashtag is trending around the world? And one way we're going to learn to do the right thing is by knowing what our baseline is. How bad a situation are we in right now? Data is so important to that. Why haven't we had a full race disparity audit in Scotland? Why aren't we having a full race disparity audit in Scotland? I welcome more disaggregated data, but I think we can be much more bolder than that. How do we have proper full data around hate crime? But how do we also recognise that the vast majority of racism isn't criminal, isn't something you can report to the police, isn't something someone can be prosecuted for? So how do we have full data around what's happening in our workplaces, whether in the public sector, the third sector or the private sector? Full data about what's happening in our public sector bodies, what's happening in our civil service, what's happening in our government. Full data about what's happening in our education settings, so we know what our baseline is, so we can set ourselves a target of where we think our ambition should be for Scotland in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time and in 20 years' time. So I want us to commit to race disparity audit, and I hope we can get that commitment from the Minister. And also in education, we defeat prejudice through education. Why are we whitewashed our history? Why are we literally teaching a whitewashed history in our schools? Why does it take me having to tell my children about the role of the British Indian Army in defence of our country in 2 world wars and defeating fascism, why aren't they taught that at school? Why aren't our children taught that our diverse and rich history is what makes Scotland and the United Kingdom what it is today, and that being the perfect answer to the far right who seek to divide rather than pull us together? And I recognise I'm short for time, so just in closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, yes, let's challenge systematic discrimination, but let's also challenge everyday racism too. Let's not have a hierarchy of prejudice. Let's not pick and choose. Let's not see this as something that's party political, and let's instead come together to have the ambition to change, not just say the right words.
Thank you very much, Mr Sarwar. And I call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Ms McAlpine, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. That comment was made by Angela Davis several decades ago, and it's still relevant today. Anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organisational structures, policies, practices and attitudes. And as parliamentarians, we have a responsibility to deliver that across all policy areas. However, given the short time we have today, I'll confine my comments to the issues around health and tackling what causes the high mortality rate from COVID affecting people from ethnic minority backgrounds. Therefore, the decision of the Scottish Government in June to set up the expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity is very welcome indeed. Their report on 18 September highlights the overlapping issues that help explain this worrying heightened mortality. That includes occupational exposure, as Anna Sarwar has talked about, for example, health care and transportation workers. It emphasises income and housing issues faced particularly by those, but not exclusively by those seeking asylum. And there are different vulnerabilities too, for example, rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. I share the disgust of other members, such as Pauline McNeill and Bill Kidd, who spoke about the UK's deplorable treatment of asylum seekers, and the expert group mentioned the treatment of asylum seekers and migrants in the UK's no recourse to public funds as a significant factor affecting health outcomes. I was also struck by the section of the report entitled Differential Access to Treatment and Other Forms of Support. It says research shows a greater risk of adverse outcomes for ethnic minority people even after hospitalisation with COVID. There is, I am very sad to say, hard evidence of these poorer outcomes. The expert group point out that in 3 Scottish surveys of minority ethnic experiences of discrimination from 2015 to 2019, 18 to 20% of respondents reported experiencing discrimination using the health services. And that is particularly worrying and sad. And that's why the expert group makes a number of recommendations with regards to tackling racism, which is the root cause of so much of this inequality. I support the recommendation of a baseline audit of past and current anti-racism initiatives to judge their effectiveness. Given that the government's existing Race Action Equality Plan, launched in 2017, runs until 2021, a systematic audit would seem both appropriate and timely. And I think this would also address the points made by some members and also in the briefing today by the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. And they point out that there is already a lot of excellent work that has been done, particularly in the areas of cultural education, shaped by Black people themselves. And it's very important that we acknowledge this and build on it rather than reinvent the wheel. The report also recommends the establishment of an observatory which brings together quantitative and qualitative data on ethnic and racial inequalities in Scotland. And as others have said, and as the report emphasises, improved data is essential in order to be anti-racist and change those systems, organisational structures, policies, practices and attitudes I mentioned at the outset. And the importance of accurate data, I noted, was also flagged up in today's amnesty briefing. I therefore wanted to conclude by flagging up the importance of the census in gathering excellent data. Scotland's the only part of the UK to postpone the 2021 census. National Records of Scotland argue that there are very good reasons to do that, and there may well be. However, in taking evidence from them last week, the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee remained concerned about their ability to deliver. So therefore, I would ask that attention is paid right across government to ensure that we have a census in 2022 which is accurate and helps us tackle the scourge of inequality and particularly the racism that we all want to eliminate.
There, I'm afraid, Ms McAlpine, it's very hard on your remote. You must conclude. So thank you very much. And now call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I too welcome today's debate. We know that the Scottish Government have allocated over £2.6 million in 1920 to fund organisations working to advance racial equality. But I think at the heart of this debate is the message that it's all our job to tackle inequality. And I think that's one of the benefits of these type of debates. And I think you can tell by the number of briefings that we've received today from stakeholders how important this issue is. And as other speakers have already commented on, as have drawn to a close, 4 minutes for each speaker is not really enough time to cover all of the main issues. We could be speaking about the museum collections or the work of Intercultural Youth Scotland, an organisation I know that Mr Sarwar and the Minister know very well, for example, in their work to increase diversity in our teaching profession and have a true account in our education system of slavery and imperialism in Scotland and the UK. But, Presiding Officer, for today I'd like to focus my remarks on the impact of COVID-19 on ethnic minorities. And I welcome the motion noting that the expert reference group's recommendations will be invaluable in responding to the inequalities that have been further exposed by COVID-19. And how important is it today, following on from the announcement of further restrictions that we heard from the First Minister earlier. And as convener of the Racial Equality Cross-Party Group, I'd like to take the opportunity to elaborate a wee bit on the last meeting held virtually over the summer recess. We heard from Professor Raj Gopal at that meeting on the issue of COVID-19. And at the time, evidence was emerging or had already emerged through the early stages of the pandemic that there was a disproportionate effect on ethnic minority communities. And as Ruth Maguire touched on earlier, we also found this in evidence to the Equalities and Human Rights Committee that I sit on. Professor Bhopal's contribution was very interesting and hard-hitting, and I can make the transcript or even a link to the video available to the ministers and their teams should they wish. His overview had an explanation that viruses and respiratory diseases in particular tend to be more common in ethnic minority and migrant groups. On this basis, he stated that he had the advice he'd provided to the Scottish Government was to expect something similar from COVID-19. Some of the main points he made about minority and ethnic migrant groups in Scotland having been affected by COVID-19 to that meeting included the mortality rates in South Asian populations are about twice as high as in the white Scottish population. Mortality rates in Chinese origin populations are somewhere between that of the South Asian population and the white Scottish population. People with recent or ancestry from Africa are about 3 or 4 times more likely to get the disease and have serious complications. People from a South Asian background are 2 or 3 times more likely to get the disease. It varies greatly in the different groups. For example, Indian populations are less likely to get it than Pakistani populations, and he did say, based on data from England, Bangladeshi populations are also less likely to get it than Pakistani populations. He did also comment that not enough numbers at the moment to produce accurate statistics for other populations and not enough info for what's going on in refugee or asylum seekers. And he said that some of that was to do with the low numbers in Scotland. So the members of the cross-party group that day had a wide array of questions relating to this presentation, and I'll relay here. Perhaps that the Minister can refer to them, summing up if she's time, or even a written response. I think actually there is a letter from the cross-party group coming to the government. But the members of the group that day wanted an understanding of how poverty... Can the member wind up, please? Only 2 minutes.
The clocks are wrong. Oh. I didn't want to do the clock had stopped. Okay, no, sorry, I'm afraid you've not just been talking 1 minute 52 seconds.
Right, okay, right.
Now you mustn't be unkind. It's been very interesting. Please conclude.
Well, I had so much more to say, Presiding Officer, but what I'll do then to sum up, because I'm not going to have the time to go through all these, is if the Minister's okay, that I will write to as convener of the cross-party group with the questions that were asked on that day at the last meeting. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry about that. But can I just warn members, I don't know if it's working again. We'll have a look. It's been a bit funny. I've now got Rona Mackay, followed by Rachel Hamilton. Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to be speaking in this important debate, a debate which is achieving consensus throughout the Chamber. Because this is a debate about humanity, about treating others as we would have them treat us. As a starting point, we should look at the subject of today's debate, promoting equality and human rights for minority ethnic people and communities. The fact is that we are all equal. There is no hierarchy in equality. So why in 2020 should we need to promote equality and human rights? Because, Presiding Officer, we live in a society that's not framed around diversity, inclusiveness, or one that can honour those rights for all people in society, regardless of race, gender or creed. In Scotland, we have a shocking immigration system imposed upon us, one which, of course, we would not choose if we had the power to change it. We have a society where asylum seekers fleeing the most appalling circumstances in their homeland are not allowed to work when or if they finally manage to enter Britain. Their human rights are being denied from the outset by not being allowed to work and to contribute to the society they've fought to be a part of. That makes no sense. Indeed, 7 of my colleagues at Westminster have this week called for an inquiry into the recent tragic deaths of 3 asylum seekers in Glasgow. Presiding Officer, it doesn't have to be like this. As the government motion says, it's incumbent on all of us to do our part to make sure minorities' rights are promoted and protected in our communities. I was struck recently by a participant in one episode of the excellent Africa series on BBC4 who said that, of course, globally, people of colour are not the minority, they are the majority. And some intolerant people would do well to remember that. Presiding Officer, the village of Twecker in my constituency is a fantastic example of how to promote equality and inclusiveness. It has an impressive record of welcoming refugees into their small community. I've attended social events organised to promote different cultures through cooking exhibitions or musical displays, for example. Community leader Sandra Sutton, who runs the Healthy Living and Enterprise Centre, makes sure no one goes short of the basic essentials. Every family is looked after, and she's the point of contact for anything that's needed to make them feel welcome and comfortable. I know it's probably easier to do that in small rural communities, but you need someone with the will and humanity to do it. And I know that in our cities and towns it's logistically different, but of course there are fantastic third sector organisations on hand for help and support. And we need a political solution with humanity at its heart. I agree with all the points that have been made today about the importance of data. The excellent organisation Close the Gap tell us that BME women face an intertwined set of gendered and racial barriers that affect their ability to enter, progress and stay in good quality employment. Indeed, COVID-19 has highlighted and exacerbated BME's women's pre-existing inequalities in the labour market. And of course, Brexit is likely to further exacerbate that inequality. In that respect, the work of the Independent Expert Reference Group in COVID-19 and ethnicity is crucial in assisting the Scottish Government to present to Parliament the actions it needs to take to address the high incidence of COVID-19 among the BME population. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, it's our collective responsibility to do what we can, however small or seemingly insignificant any action can be, because that would make all the difference to those who we welcome in an inclusive, integrated Scotland and help us to embrace that which unites us as human beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I call Ms Hamilton, can I say that, that this area has been placed on alert pending the investigation of a potential fire. Everyone present in both the chamber and the gallery, we haven't got near the gallery just now, should remain where they are until further directions are provided. As all our speakers for this item of business are present, I propose to continue with business and issue an update when further information becomes available. What a cue for you to come in, Ms Hamilton. On you come.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I definitely am on fire. But firstly, I'd like to thank the Scottish Government for bringing forward this debate today. And thank you, Presiding Officer, for allowing me to step out of the chamber. As we continue to live with the effects of COVID-19, and especially this week, and the statement from the First Minister today about the infections rising, it's a wake-up call for all of us that the virus is very much out there and spreading. Sadly, we know that people with BAME backgrounds are worst affected by the pandemic, with a high proportion of the population experiencing the devastating consequences of this disease. We are all too aware of this concerning trend, and the UK Government Disparities in the Risk and Outcomes of COVID-19 report on the impact of the pandemic on the BAME population highlighted people of Bangladeshi ethnicity had around twice the risk of death than people of white British ethnicity. People of Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, other Asian, Caribbean and black ethnicity had between 10% and 50% higher risk of death, which Alexander Stewart, my colleague, mentioned. On BAME women in particular, the impact of COVID-19 and associated lockdowns have been far more pronounced. Women are likely to be unemployed as a result of this pandemic, and the Institute of Fiscal Studies and the UCL Institute of Education found that mothers were 47% more likely to have permanently lost their job or quit, and 14% were more likely to have been furloughed since the start of the crisis. The employment rate for ethnic minorities is lower than that for white Scots, leading to an employment rate gap of 16.4%, meaning again that they are disproportionately affected by the economic impact of this pandemic. We know two sectors expected to be hardest hit in the post-COVID world are hospitality and retail, both of which employ significant numbers of BAME female workers. And we must remember COVID-19 has not created health and structural inequalities. It has highlighted and exacerbated existing structural and institutional inequalities and barriers which exist across healthcare, but also across wider society. These have been laid bare during the course of this pandemic, and I know I'm speaking about it a lot, but it is and has acted as a catalyst for exposing these entrenched inequalities. The UK Conservative government acknowledged that the massive inequalities that exist must be examined. In July, the Prime Minister announced the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. It has been tasked with investigating how inequalities in the UK manifest in areas such as health, education, criminal justice and employment, with the findings to be reported back by the end of the year. At this point, I want to say that I am very proud that my party has not only acted at government level, but also at party level. Recently, there was a launch of the Scottish Conservative Friends of BAME. This is an umbrella organisation working directly with the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party to support the BAME communities of Scotland. Presiding Officer, I'm glad the Scottish Government have recognised too the need to take affirmative action to ensure that promoting equality and human rights for minority ethnic communities is a priority. We're happy to accept the government motion and the amendment from Pauline McNeill. And I welcome calls from the Royal College of Nursing which echo those of the Scottish Government's independent expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity recommendations on data collection. As stated by Pauline McNeill, we need to see the government have an in-depth and detailed data on the impacts on people from BAME backgrounds if we are to best establish where to target support. And the government must take the recommendations on board immediately from this group. I'll finish there, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I call Annabel Ewing, the excitement has died down. It was a false alarm. I call Annabel Ewing, who's the last speaker in the open debate. We move to closing speeches. Ms Ewing, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The lights have come up. I don't know. I don't think I've risen to the occasion with my speech, but I'll try. But thank you very much for calling me to speak in what is a really important debate. And as has been said many times, but it has to be said again, there can be no more important mark of a civilised society than how it treats its minorities. And I think it's clear from the speeches across the chamber that everybody firmly believes that. And I also noted the Cabinet Secretary's remarks in her opening statement, and I'm very pleased to note that the Scottish Government too is determined to play its part in eradicating racism, inequality and injustice, and to tackle the scars that they bring as a priority. I was interested to note when doing some reading for this speech today that the Scottish Government is intent on proceeding with mainstreaming these issues right across government portfolios, which is really important because quite often things can get lost in silos in government, and it's really, really important that there's a cross-portfolio approach. I also had noted that there had been a funding allocation of £2.6 million in 2019-20 to support organisations working to advance race equality, and it is that work on the ground that is hugely important as well. I noted also that the Parliament, of course, had strongly indicated its determination to see established a Museum of Slavery and Empire in Scotland, and I appreciate for the two emails I think we've had that the importance of this project requires that it is proceeded with maximum input from all those who wish to have their voices heard, and with great sensitivity, and I welcome the Scottish Government's sponsoring of an expert group to progress that work. A key development, as has been referred to, has been, of course, the report of the expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity, and I guess I'm hearing that the Scottish Government is actually going to take up all the recommendations, but we wait to hear the detail of how they plan to do that. I note that they have already taken forward the important recommendations concerning making ethnicity a mandatory field in health databases, linking data in the census and ensuring that ethnicity data collection is embedded in the NHS in Scotland. And that was a key ask on the part of the group, and quite rightly so, for without reliable data, we are not proceeding as best we can or should be in terms of looking at the what needs to be done. If there's gaps in the evidence, that makes that task much more difficult. I note that also another key area where there's a need for more disaggregated data concerns the labour market, and indeed the need to hear directly from minority ethnic workers of their experiences in the labour market, particularly as far as women are concerned, as highlighted by Close the Gap. In this regard, it is indeed very, very concerning to note that the expert reference group found that those working in the health and social care setting in Scotland have experienced discrimination. That is truly unacceptable, particularly taking into account the heroic efforts that they have made in contributing to tackling the coronavirus, and these issues must be addressed. On the wider human rights agenda, I note that there have been calls from Amnesty International and others for the incorporation of the UN Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination into Scots law, and I know that that is currently being considered. I would also finally wish to commend the STUC Black Workers Committee for all its hard work in this area, and to indicate my support for its Break the Race Ceiling campaign, which intends to create a level playing field for minority ethnic workers in the private, public and third sectors. I would also welcome the efforts of Fife Centre for Equalities in terms of its work in terms of inclusion across the Kingdom of Fife. In conclusion, it is evident that there is a lot of good work going on, but as has been said quite rightly, first of all, it's not just the responsibility of government, it's the responsibility of each of us. Secondly, it is all very well to continue to talk. Talking is good, but actions are much more important. So we need to get on with that. I'm conscious of my responsibility as MSP for Cowdenbeath constituency, and I pledge to do what I can to help to make a difference. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Closing speech is a call, Sarah Boyack, to close for Labour. Ms Boyack, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this has been an excellent debate with an unusual level of cross-party agreement on the need for action across society. But it is about leadership, monitoring and implementation to give people real opportunities. And as several colleagues have highlighted, we need to tackle the deep-seated inequalities which have been reinforced by the pandemic. I do want to just reference the life of one of my former constituents, Saroj Lal, who passed away sadly this summer. Because when she started teaching at South Morningside Primary School in 1970, she wasn't just the first BAME teacher at South Morningside, but amongst the first in Scotland. And her training as a teacher was instrumental in preparing her for her work on multiculturalism and anti-racist education. So many of the teaching materials she had to use presented a skewed, prejudiced view of the world, and she went on to challenge perceptions and stereotypes throughout her life, fighting for a more equal and balanced representation of minority ethnic communities at the point at which it really matters in children's education. So the point Anas Sarwar made today about the need for change that is still needed was incredibly powerful. Saroj worked with key organisations in Edinburgh, NKS Millen and LREC, that continue to work in my community striving for equality. Yet while groups like Racial Equality Councils are vital in driving a change in attitudes and supporting people to stand up from BAME backgrounds, we do need government leadership and action to bring the transformational change needed. A survey by Business in the Community found that 1 in 3 black people felt ethnicity would be a barrier to progressing in their workplace, compared with 1% of white people. And as many have said today, the pandemic has starkly highlighted the concentration of BME workers in low-paid jobs and has disproportionately impacted on their safety through poor access to PPE and variable implementation of safety measures. So I think we want to thank those trade union reps across the country who have put in the hard slog of negotiating with their employers, who've been working hard to raise these issues, such as Ian Mullen, one of our Unison reps in Edinburgh, whether it's the councils, the IJBs or the care sector. We have some fundamental changes that need to be made, and they need to be made now. One of the key recommendations in the UK Government's 2017 McGregor-Smith report was to ensure that the public sector is using its purchasing power to drive change by setting and publishing targets to make sure they don't entrench inequalities. And I think that's something that needs to be done at the Scottish level, but it also needs to be done in our local authorities as well. And community wealth building has been talked about recently. We need to make sure that we link into ethnic minority communities as well. So again, we have a fine-grained analysis of how money is being spent, what impact is actually happening. Finally, I want to focus on the issue about the overrepresentation of black and ethnic minority workers in low-paid jobs, because it also links into other inequalities. What's called intersectionality, multiple discrimination, particularly in relation to the gender pay gap. In Scotland, women still earn 15% less than men, and they still see obstacles in progression in the workplace. But as Close the Gap have highlighted, the lack of data on the experiences of black and ethnic minority women in the workforce, that means that we've got to fix it now, because we still don't know exactly how challenging it is, and we're still not focusing on the solutions. Polly McNeill, in her opening remarks, mentioned the fact that she hadn't included the requirement for an equality impact assessment that the Scottish Government should carry out in their programme for government. And I'm sure that means that her amendment will be accepted today. But it's an important point, because an EQIA enables policy to be truly inclusive by assessing how it will impact on different groups of people and enabling adjustments to be made before a policy is enacted. And delivering an EQIA for the programme for government would not just be symbolic, it would help drive real practical change. And as Sarwar, I think, summed up very well the need for data and evidence. And actually in this chamber today, there is cross-party agreement on the need to make the changes that we've all argued for to advance human rights and equality for minority ethnic people and the wider communities. This has been a really, really good debate. I don't think it's been a boring debate. It's actually focused on changes that need to be made. So let us make sure that we push hard on the government, that government ministers know that they have our support for doing this, and that while the pandemic has pushed back progress on equalities, that's what's prompted our amendment. I'm sure it's what's prompted the Conservative amendment. If we pass both amendments, and if we agree today, then let's say this is about urgent action. We need to make progress, and we need accountability, and people from our black and ethnic minority communities need to know that we are all going to push for this, not just in a debate, but in the committees, as others have talked about. Let's make this happen. Let's make the change we need. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I call on Annie Wells to close with Conservatives. Ms Wells, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close for my party and contribute to a thoughtful debate that has seen many excellent contributions from across the chamber. It is an emotive subject to discuss, and although as a country we pride ourselves on being open and welcoming, it is clear we are not all the way there yet. It is right to aspire to an equal society whilst recognising that more action needs to be taken to achieve it. We must aspire to be the equal society, not just because it's our responsibility, but also because doing so will help unlock the potential of people and communities that contribute so much to our national life. But despite a lot of work, there is still progress to be made. I can recognise this by just looking at the city that I'm proud to represent. Today, Glasgow is one of our most diverse and multicultural cities, welcoming to all, regardless as to someone's background. But sadly, that's not always the case. Only a few years ago, racially motivated attacks in Glasgow schools were on the rise. Only a few months ago, there was a coronavirus-related racial hate crime incident in the West End. And when it comes to demonstrating the prejudice and discrimination faced by minority communities, to this day, the experiences of parliamentary colleagues Anas Sarwar and Hamza Yusuf in particular have given a chilling insight into real life for many minority ethnic people, whether that's in person or online. It is profoundly difficult to hear examples of this, especially when it's not a sentiment most of us see or hear as part of our daily lives. It makes it all the more important to take every opportunity to eradicate such behaviour whenever it appears. And on this, I appreciate the unity of purpose expressed on all sides of the chamber. Now, the debate today has focused on the effect that structural inequalities have had on the increased danger from coronavirus in our BAME communities. The early evidence appears to support the conclusion that people from minority backgrounds, particularly those who work in healthcare, are at a higher risk from COVID, and we need to work out why. This is why I welcome many of the actions that have been discussed during this afternoon's debate. The expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity will, I hope, prove to be a valuable resource when it presents its recommendations in the coming months. As the Royal College of Nursing have said, COVID did not create the structural inequalities in health faced by minority communities. It exacerbated them. Research from the expert reference group will go a long way to establishing the extent of the problem currently being faced, which can only be a useful resource to the Scottish Government shapes its response going forward. Other recommendations from the group have been taken forward already, such as the publication of workplace assessments to help minority ethnic staff working in healthcare settings, and direct engagement with minority ethnic communities to address their concerns as quickly as possible. These are welcome steps, and I hope will continue in the weeks and months ahead, and I welcome the Minister's continued commitment. But there are other ways in which COVID has exposed areas where we need to do better. Another is in respect of the labour market and the effect of prolonged shutdowns on the availability of secure work, particularly for BME women. As we've heard, research from Close the Gap shows that BME women are more likely to be in insecure work, putting themselves at increased risk of significant loss of earnings, and that these insecure jobs are more susceptible to redundancies. Close the Gap have also indicated that almost a quarter of BME mothers have been struggling to feed their family during this pandemic. As much as we might think a global pandemic affects us all in the same way, the evidence tells us different and increasingly disproportionate story. With that said, I think there is another side to this. We face one of the most difficult periods in our recent history, which has exposed structural disparities that have put minority ethnic communities at heightened risk. But it gives us the opportunities to fundamentally correct these problems. It gives us a chance to make sure that minority communities are protected throughout the pandemic, but also that they have the opportunities to thrive as well afterwards. Think of the benefits across society if we pull down the barriers to success that have thwarted people for years. Think of the difference it will make to kids growing up today, no matter where they live, to know that they have just as much of a chance to achieve greatness as anyone else. So the action we take as a consequence of the pandemic can firstly ensure that we protect people from the disproportionately adverse effects their communities are experiencing. Public health rightly remains a priority, but our action can also challenge inequalities that are not new and have held people back from achieving their potential for years. If we can use the collective will demonstrated today, then I am confident that the right solutions can be found to protect, uphold and further the rights of our minority communities and support their fight for equality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Christina McKelvey to pose for the Government. Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I give my grateful thanks to the entire Chamber for the way we've conducted this debate today. It's been an incredibly informative debate, and hopefully I'll get round to answering everybody's questions, but that may be a challenge given the amount of issues that people have brought up today. Can also say thank you to the organisations that have provided us with all of our briefings, because again, you know, absolutely amazing work in there, lots of challenge in there and lots of questions in there which we have to take the responsibility of responding to. Presiding Officer, we all know there's more to be done if we want to see that truly equal society that we've all spoken about. I hope it's also been clear today that in our words and in our actions that we are sincerely committed to achieving that goal for minority ethnic communities along with everyone in Scotland. And when the expert reference group on COVID and ethnicity sent us its recommendations, I wrote to our Cabinet colleagues asking them to consider what they could do within their own portfolios to contribute to that work. Fulton McGregor mentioned Raj Bhopal, who was a member of our expert reference group, and I would commend his presentation to all of my colleagues in the Chamber and the work that he's done. And I'll also look out for Fulton McGregor's cross-party group letter with all of his questions as well. Presiding Officer, I'm also delighted to say that in their responses, my Cabinet colleagues and ministers across all of the portfolios are taking up that challenge that the expert reference group have set them, and we will have a fuller response to the expert reference group's recommendations as soon as we possibly can. And I'm sure that will be music to the ears to Annabel Ewing and a number of others who asked us about how are we mainstreaming, how are we working across government, how are we making that difference. I hope that will give you an example of how we are doing that. All of those responses, I think, we'll be able to publish as well, and people will be able to see. Can I pick up an issue that Annie Wells finished on there? And it was around about hate crime and some of the issues that we've all faced during the last few months, but over many years now. And I would appeal to the Chamber, now that we've got, you know, some progress on the hate crime legislation coming before us, that we work together, because there's many organisations, there's many individuals and there's many communities who really need a modern hate crime piece of legislation that works for them. And in our programme for government, you can see the way in which equality and human rights has been approached, not as a standalone subject, but as a golden thread that I believe that weaves together all of our ambitions for Scotland. And that's the process that we will be taking with mainstreaming all of this work, the work that the mainstreaming team have been doing across all portfolios and supporting them with EQIAs and progressing equality and human rights in all of their work. I'm of course very proud to see the programme for government include specific initiatives designed to promote equality for minority ethnic communities, some of which the Cabinet Secretary noted in her opening remarks. However, I am equally proud to see the underpinning commitments to an equality-focused approach to all of our work across all portfolios and responsibilities. That means that mainstreaming that everyone's called for, Annabel Ewing and others have called for, that intersectionality of the issue, of where it intersections with, if you've got, you know, a minority ethnic background, you're an older person, you have a disability, you're a woman. All of these issues are being taken very seriously by this government. But we can't stop there. We know we can't stop there. We need everyone in every corner of society to follow the lead that we are setting here, all of us, and to think about why, what we need to do and why we need to live up to our responsibilities and enact real, lasting change for minority ethnic communities. Annie Wells and Jeremy Balfour asked and mentioned about responsibility, that it's our responsibility to set examples and challenge racism wherever we find it, and we agree with them completely. And can I also commend the STUC Black Workers group? I met with them last week, and I would commend also their campaign Break the Race. They've got a great presentation, and I'm hoping to see it again because there was so much in it, but I would commend that to others as well. And the same Sarah Boyack mentioned trade unions. I meet every Friday now with the STUC on the Safer Workplaces work that I'm doing, and the impact of that work is incredibly important in their member-led organisations. Can also pay tribute to Soraj Lal as well, a real inspiration in the work that she did, and I'm sure a huge loss to Sarah Boyack's community and to all of Scotland. Presiding Officer, I've also heard first-hand about the incredible work being done by organisations of all sizes across Scotland in the face of the COVID-19 crisis. And there's so many to mention, but there's one big group that I can mention, the Minority Ethnic Resilience Network, who, if you've not seen what they've all been doing, it will give you much hope and much inspiration, but they have done an amazing work. I've been honestly so impressed by their resilience, their innovation, the community, how communities have worked together, how they've really shown how coming together has ensured that, for example, older minority ethnic people have access to culturally appropriate food. Something, you know, that is incredibly important, that younger people have access to the support and counselling sessions in a way that suits them, and online workshops to help them navigate these really difficult times. I'm also very pleased, as others have mentioned, to be able to support organisations with funding throughout COVID and over and above the £2.6 million funding for 2019-20 to support all of the work that they're doing to advance race equality. As the Cabinet Secretary said in her opening remarks, we have an opportunity before us. Instead of returning to how things were, we can learn the lessons that have been taught to us by COVID-19 and, of course, by the Black Lives Matter movement. John Finney mentioned briefly in his contribution our work with Gypsy Travellers, and the action plan is something I've spoken about a lot in this chamber. But we set up a COVID response Gypsy Traveller group, and if you want to see inspirational work of how a community can pull together and really use tiny bits of money to make sure people are supported properly, then that's one to have a look at. There was a number of issues that were brought up through the course of the debate today on data, on the recommendation about data, on what we need to do around data, the challenges that we face for people who work in environments where they may be more at risk. And we've created guidance which includes a simple risk assessment tool that supports individual decision making, not just for employers but employees too. And that risk assessment tool is based on clinical and scientific evidence that takes into account the personal characteristics, and I'm sure that's something that everybody was interested in, whether it's ethnicity, age, gender, BMI or other health conditions, and that assesses an individual's overall vulnerability to COVID-19. I know that's something that Jeremy Balfour and Asawa, Rachel Hamilton, Philip McGregor were all interested in as well. On data and data collection, NRS have been a part of the expert reference group, and they managed to do a piece of work by linking up to the census, and you'll know that one of the recommendations is to link the data that we currently collect to the census, but also to collect more and appropriate data as well. So we'll be looking very closely at those recommendations and how we can take that forward. And I know that was a number of concerns from many of the speakers today, including how we link that to the census, and the NRS are very happy to take part in that work and respond. And I know that's something that Joan McAlpine was very interested in as well. A couple of quick remarks, Presiding Officer, because I know we're just about finishing, was on asylum, I believe. But I agree with Rona Mackay that the right to work should be an absolute. But whilst that's not an absolute, we've still got work to do around about no recourse to public funds. And I know my Cabinet colleague Aileen Campbell has written on a number of occasions now to the UK Government seeking ways in which we can resolve some of the challenges around no recourse to public funds. I know Polly McNeill, Bill Kidd, and many other people were interested, including Ruth Maguire, on that. And really quickly as well, the Public Sector Quality Duty Review, the mainstreaming team have been working with all of our Cabinet colleagues to ensure that equality and human rights at EQIAs are embedded in the work that we're doing, and they will repivot back to looking at the Public Sector Equality Duty Review work that we need to do in the coming months as well, and I'll be able to update Parliament on that very, very soon. Presiding Officer, Scottish Government's also looking to undertake a review of all of our initiatives as well. Whether it's a race disparity audit or not, we are looking at how we can do that better, and we're seeking some understanding in how the UK Government are taking that forward as well. Presiding Officer, to finish, and as Sarwar said, we need to be brave, and are we brave enough? I hope we are. I think we are, and I really wish that we take up that opportunity, because I am absolutely committed to this. So, Presiding Officer, I think we can be bold, I think we can take meaningful action, and I think we can move forward together. We just want that fairer, stronger, more equal society for everyone, and hopefully today's debate has taken us further down that path to those positive steps. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Minister. And that concludes the debate on advancing equality and human rights for minority ethnic people and communities. It's time to move on to the next item of business, which is decision time. And there are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is Amendment 22770.2 in the name of Jeremy Balfour, which seeks to amend Motion 22770 in the name of Shirley-Ann Somerville on advancing equality and human rights for minority ethnic people and communities be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed. The second question is that Amendment 22770.3 in the name of Polly McNeill, which seeks to amend motion 22770 in the name of Shirley Ann Somerville and advancing equality and human rights for minority ethnic people and communities be agreed. Are we all agreed? The amendment is therefore agreed. The final question is that motion 22770 in the name of Shirley Ann Somerville as amended on advancing equality and human rights for minority ethnic people and communities be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed. What a relief that I'm not having to do that remote voting. That's all I can tell you. Thank you for that. That concludes decision time, and there'll be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.